you, Senator Coons. And I'd like to go back briefly to Mr. Mayor. In your written testimony, you said that the science behind climate change and its effect on minority communities, quote, should not be up for debate. I'm curious, is the Sierra Club, is this a frequent practice to declare areas of science not up for debate, not up for consideration of what the evidence and data show?
If you are relying on the evidence and data, you know, the science, the preponderance of the evidence are there.
But that's a different thing than saying we should not debate a question, that the Sierra Club has declared this scientific issue resolved and there should be no debate.
Based upon the preponderance of the evidence, the science is settled, but the thing is that anything is up for debate, Senator. We can debate anything.
Well, you know, I would note that even the phrase preponderance of the evidence, having been a practicing lawyer for many years, means 51%. That means at least 51% is what the preponderance means. You know, I would ask, for example, if you want to end debate, you don't want to address the facts, how do you address the fact that in the last 18 years the satellite data show no demonstrable warming whatsoever?
Sir, I would rely upon the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I would rely upon the evidence, and again, from our own NOAA officials. The data are there.
Is it correct that the satellite data over the last 18 years demonstrate no significant warming?
No.
How is it incorrect?
Based upon our experts, it's been refuted long ago, and it's not up for scientific debate.
I'm curious if I want to understand this. I do find it highly interesting that the president of the Sierra Club, when asked what the satellite data demonstrate about warming, apparently is relying on staff. So
it's just a mistake.
The nice thing about the satellite data is these are objective numbers.
Correct.
And the numbers over the last 18 years, are you familiar with the phrase the pause?
The answer is yes, and essentially we rest on our position.
And to what you said, you are familiar with the pause, so to what does the phrase the pause refer? I'm sorry, you said you were familiar with that term, so I asked to what does it refer?
Essentially, it's the slowing in global warming during the 40s, sir.
During the 40s? Is it not the term that global warming alarmists have used to explain the inconvenient truth, to use a phrase popularized by former Vice President Al Gore, that the satellite data over the last 18 years demonstrate no significant warming whatsoever? Global warming alarmists call that the pause, because the computer models say there should be dramatic warming, and yet the actual satellites taking the measurement don't show any significant warming.
But, Senator, 97% of the scientists concur and agree that there is global warming and anthropogenic impact with regards to global.
The problem with that statistic that gets cited a lot is it's based on one bogus study. And indeed, your response, I would point that your response is quite striking. I asked about the science and the evidence, the actual data. We have satellites. They're measuring temperature. That should be relevant. And your answer was, pay no attention to your lying eyes and the numbers that the satellites show. Instead, listen to the scientists who are receiving massive grants who tell us, do not debate the science.
Sir, this is one of the national pastimes in America, and while we're debating what 97% of scientists have already settled, the 3% that we, as I say, have invested in with regards to the carbon industry, you know, our planet is cooking and heating up and warming. So this is one of the reasons why.
So hold on a second. It is the Sierra Club's position that right now the Earth is cooking up and heating and warming. Is that the Sierra Club's? I mean, I just want to quote you and understand.
I am saying I concur with 97% of the world's scientists with regards to global warming and the anthropogenic effects of mankind with regards to climate.
But sir, would you answer the question? Is it the Sierra Club's position, as you just testified, that the Earth is cooking up and heating and warming right now? Is that the Sierra Club's position?
Global temperatures are on the rise, sir.
And I assume the Sierra Club would issue a public retraction if confronted with the facts that the data are precisely as I described, that over the last 18 years, there has been no significant warming, and indeed, that is why global warming alarmists invented the term the pause to explain what they call the pause in global warming, because the data demonstrate what you just said, that the Earth is cooking and warming is not backed up by the data.
We are concurring with 97% of the scientists that absolutely say the opposite, sir.
So if the data are contrary to your testimony, would the Sierra Club issue a retraction?
Sir, we concur with the 97% scientific consensus with regards to global warming.
I'd like to repeat, certainly in a moment, but I'd like to repeat the question and get an answer. If the data are contrary to your testimony, would the Sierra Club issue a retraction?
We concur with 97% of the scientists that believe that the anthropogenic impacts of mankind with regards to global warming are true.
So does that mean you're not willing to answer the question?
We can concur with the preponderance of the evidence and the science at 97%. You're asking me if we take the 3% over the 97%?
No, I'm actually not asking about a survey among scientists. I'm asking about the objective data, the numbers.
The scientists rely upon their objective data and their analysis, and 97% have concurred and conclude that global warming is indeed a fact.
You know, Mr. Meyer, I find it striking that for a public policy organization that purports to focus exclusively on environmental issues, that you're not willing to tell this committee that you would issue a retraction if your testimony is objectively false under scientific data. That undermines the credibility of any organization if you will persist in a political position regardless of what the science shows, regardless of the facts, regardless of the evidence, and regardless of the data. That is not consistent, I would suggest, with sound public policy.
Sir, you can pick whatever, choose and cherry pick whatever data you wish, but I concur with the 97% of scientists who concur that global warming is a fact.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just simply wanted to observe that we have a broadly representative and qualified group of folks who were brought here to talk about overregulation and its impact on minority communities. And I don't speak for the Sierra Club, obviously, but it is my hope and expectation that if you want to pursue that line of inquiry with them further, they'd be happy to. But my assumption is that we will continue to focus on the subject of the hearing at hand.
And I certainly concur with Senator Coons, and I would note that Mr. Mayer's written testimony and oral testimony focused in significant part on the Obama administration's new global warming regulations that could cost up to 10 million jobs, impose massive costs on American consumers. And so he argued that the data support causing millions of Americans to lose their jobs, including millions of African Americans and Hispanics. And I was pressing on what the data was that he was testifying about. And I would note that is not only relevant to his testimony, it was almost the entire subject of his testimony. And yet, apparently, the testimony is not based on the data or the evidence, or he is not prepared to discuss the data or evidence beyond asserting that we should take the word, to take their word for it. With that, I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. Thank you for joining us. We will be keeping the hearing record open for an additional 5 business days, which means the record will be closed at the end of the business day on Tuesday, October 13th, 2015. Thank you very much to each of the witnesses. The hearing is
what you're basing your metadata on, where your samples are taken from, and then also what's your opinion of the data that I have before me, which seems contrary to what you're putting forward.
I'm showing you the original data, And what you're looking at is the data that has been tampered with by NOAA and by NASA. And I could show you curves of what that data looked like in 1936, what it looked like in 1980, what it looked like in 1990 and 2000. And the temperatures, the high temperatures in the 1930s get cooler every year. They put out a new issue, and the temperatures that are in the 2000 plus get warmer because they have frankly tampered with the data. That's the difference between what you're looking at and what I'm looking at. Mine is the original data.
One quick follow-up, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
So the National Science Foundation, NASA, and NOAA have manipulated the data.
Yes, that's true. I can show you the data that they have manipulated. I'm not saying that they have done something which is scurrilous and evil. What I'm saying simply is something that everybody will agree on, and that is that they have what they call adjusted the data. And if you look at how they have adjusted it, the 1930s always get lower because of the adjustments they made from the original data, and the 2000 plus always get warmer. That's the case, and I can show you data that will indicate that if you like.
You're talking about a trend, particularly over the last decade, maybe 15 years of cooling. Yet what I have before me is that 2000 to 2012 was the warmest 12-year period in instrumental record. In other words, since we've been recording heat of the planet and what we're in, the last 12 years were the hottest on record. And that's peer-reviewed data that I have before me. And so my question to you is that because what I'm looking at has been manipulated by NASA and NOAA and the National Science Foundation, or what's the difference here? Because we obviously have conflicting information before us.
Right. I don't know what your data is or where it came from, so I can't answer that specifically why it's different. What I can tell you is that the data that I'm showing you is original data, and as I've just shown you, the 1930s were the warmer decade than the past decade. If you use original data, that's what I'm telling you.
Thank you.
And if you have something that's different than that, my guess would be, although without knowing what your data is, I can't say for sure, is probably that this is manipulated data by NOAA, NASA, or the subunit of NASA that deals with climate. And what they do is they make what they call adjustments to their data, the net effect of which is to make the earlier warm periods, like the 1930s, cooler, and raise the temperature of the last decade artificially, not from the original data. Mine is original data.
Is this a conspiracy?
I'm not into conspiracy, so I have no comment on that. I'm simply a data purveyor, so I'm going to present you with data, and you can draw your own conclusions.
So how do you account for the IPCC report that came out in 2007, which is due to be updated, and over 800 scientists are working on it now, but thousands of scientists worked on this and came to the conclusion that climate change is real and it's human caused. How do you account for all of those folks saying that, and it's obviously very different than what you're presenting to us today?
All these people who are the so-called consensus, you will see, I see every day, quoted, 97% of all scientists believe that man-made CO2 causes global warming. That's a fraudulent statement. And the statement that there is a dominant consensus among scientists that CO2 is causing global warming is not based on any known fact. And let me tell you where this number comes from, and let me tell you where that off-quoted statement comes from. There was a graduate student who, this was in Indiana or Illinois, sent out 10,257 questionnaires to climate scientists. He got 3,146 back responses. Of those, he selected either 77 or 79, I'm not quite sure the numbers, correct, it doesn't matter, that he handpicked out of these 3,000 responses. And he asked those people, do you think CO2 is causing climate change? And funny thing, all but 2 said yes, because they were hand-selected. And so the real number is that there were 77 or 75 scientists out of 30,100, not out of 77 or 79. So if you divide this number over that number, you get 2%. So the consensus that you're hearing is 2%, not 98%. If you were to then look at, well, what is the consensus? whoops, let's go back to this. I have some information that you would find interesting. It's called the Petition Project. And this was a petition. And let me read what the statement says. It says, there is no convincing scientific evidence that human release of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing or will in the foreseeable future cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of the Earth's climate. How many scientists who have degrees in one of the sciences signed that? And the answer is 31,487. As opposed to the 77 in this survey that's so oft quoted. So I would say the consensus is that scientists do not believe that CO2 is causing global warming, not the other way around. So if you compare what you're seeing on the screen with what I've just read you, of these 31,000 scientists who signed this statement, all have degrees in one of the sciences, and 9,029 have PhDs in those. And the expertise of these is atmospheric, environmental, earth sciences, computer and mathematical sciences, physics and aerospace sciences, chemistry, biology, agriculture. These are real scientists, and there are 31,000 of them. In order for the statement to be true that either the consensus is that CO2 is causing it, you would need to have 32,000 people signed, and there are about 4,000 people who were involved in the IPCC project, and by admission of the chairman of the IPCC for the UN, 80% of those are non-scientists. If you look at the 27 people who wrote the executive summary for the 2007 report, which is so often quoted, guess how many have experience in meteorology? None. So there's the answer to your question.
Senator Billick has a question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my understanding of the consensus was not based on a survey. It was based on a review of the scientific papers, the peer-reviewed scientific papers. It showed that the overwhelming majority of scientific papers, peer-reviewed, showed either that had a consensus about climate change being human-caused, and a few that came to no conclusion.
True. And that is that the editorial boards of virtually every scientific journal, probably in the world, but certainly in the United States, the Geological Society of America, the American Geophysical Union, Science, Nature, all of these places, will not even read a paper that has anything negative to say about CO2. So it's not surprising that there are no papers published that are critical of CO2 as a cause, because their editorial boards will not permit it. And that is a fact, and there are some numbers that go with that. I don't happen to have them handy, but it's clear that the peer review process, the editorial process, has been taken over by what I call CO2 dogmatists who will not permit publication of anything that's in any way critical of CO2, and that's a fact. So your statement could be true. There might be more peer-reviewed papers being published right now because they won't publish anything else. Okay, let's finish this up quickly. So how do we go about predicting climate? How are we going to figure out what the state of Washington needs to do in the future? There are two ways to do it. One is the UN way, the IPCC way, which is with computer models. And computer models, like any other computer thing, is garbage in, garbage out. Whatever you program the computer will be, it's what comes out the other end. They do not consider real life changes in the atmosphere, in the oceans. They do not consider real physical data. It's all theoretical. The other way is to use real physical evidence to establish cyclical patterns. This is on-the-ground research, the kind of information I've been showing you. So let's compare the two. Which one gives us the best answer? Which one should we rely on to go about predicting what's going to happen in the state of Washington? This black curve here is a curve that I took as is from the official IPCC website in the year 2000. This is what their projection was in the year 2000. It actually continues on down here a ways, but I don't have it on this curve. And they were predicting that the temperature between 2000 and 2010 was going to be increased by 1 full degree, a 1 degree warming, which is greater than the warming for the entire century. That's what they were predicting in a decade. Here is the actual record, which is the satellite record that we've already seen, and look at the gap between the two. The models failed miserably. They weren't even close. Therefore, what trust can you put in models if they cannot even predict 10 years down the line within 1 degree? They're useless.